Hello, my name is Clara Reynolds. I'm a flight attendant who spent nearly 10 years in the air, but there's one flight I'll never forget. It wasn't because of turbulence, a passenger issue, or an engine fault. It was because we heard our captain's voice calling for help when he hadn't said a single word. The flight from Vienna to Lisbon began like any other crisp evening route across Europe. The cabin lights glowed a soft amber. Passengers murmured as they settled in, and the faint hum of the engines filled the air with a steady comfort that every frequent flyer learns to tune into. I had worked this route countless times before, and our captain that night, James Carter, was one of those pilots everyone trusted without question. Calm, methodical, and composed, he had a way of making even the most nervous passengers feel safe just by his tone. I remember the smell of brewed coffee and the faint hiss of the galley oven as I helped my fellow attendant Mia prepare the first round of drinks. Outside, the sunset was fading into a violet haze, the horizon melting into the Atlantic distance. The first 2 hours went smoothly. No passenger complaints, no turbulence, no technical blips. Everything about that evening felt normal, almost peaceful, until it didn't. It started with a small sound, a sharp crackle over the intercom. At first we ignored it, assuming it was just static interference or a headset adjustment from the cockpit. But then came the voice. Clear, controlled, familiar. Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 273. Engine failure. Immediate descent required. The words hit me before I fully processed them. The voice was unmistakably Captain Carter's. I froze, tray in hand, staring at Mia, who stood wide-eyed, her lips parting slightly in confusion. We both looked toward the cockpit door, as if expecting someone to come out and clarify what we just heard. The passengers barely reacted. Most were wearing headphones or half asleep. But for the crew, that voice triggered an instant chill. I rushed to the interphone, pressed the cockpit line, and spoke quickly. "Captain, did you just make a distress call?" There was a short silence. Then his calm, steady voice came through. "No, Clara, we didn't transmit anything. Why?" I felt my stomach drop. "We just heard your voice over the cabin intercom. You said, 'Mayday.'" Everyone heard it. Another pause, this time longer. Then, "Stay calm, I'll check the system." When the line went dead, Mia whispered, "Clara." That was his voice. Exactly. She wasn't wrong. It wasn't distorted or robotic. It sounded live, human. Every inflection, every breath, exactly how the captain would sound in an emergency. A few passengers began glancing around, having caught fragments of the message. I smiled politely, saying it was a small technical glitch, but inside, my pulse was racing. I'd heard weird intercom echoes before, sure, but never something that clear, and certainly not a distress call. 5 minutes passed, then the sound came again, this time louder. "Mayday, Mayday, Flight 273, engine failure, immediate descent required." The same words, the same cadence, but as it echoed through the cabin, I looked toward the cockpit door and saw something that made my chest tighten. The indicator light above the cockpit door, the one that glows when the intercom is active, was off. That meant the cockpit wasn't transmitting. No one was pressing the mic, yet the voice played through the speakers perfectly, as though coming from nowhere. The captain called me a minute later, his tone more serious now. "Clara, confirm what you heard." I repeated the words, line by line. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Okay, stay calm. We'll look into it. Continue service for now." That was easier said than done. The rest of the crew whispered in the galley, wondering if it could be radio interference from another aircraft, maybe another Flight 273? But flight numbers aren't reused on overlapping routes. There shouldn't have been any confusion in the system. When I passed through the cabin again, a man in seat 14 amperes stopped me. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I used to be in the Air Force. That sounded like a legitimate distress code. Are you sure everything's okay?" I forced a polite smile. "Yes, sir. It's just a minor communication glitch." He nodded slowly, unconvinced. His hand lingered on the armrest, as if ready to brace for something unseen. Back in the galley, Mia whispered, "You heard what he said, right? Engine failure? Should we check the wings or something?" I laughed nervously, though it sounded wrong in my own ears. If the engines were failing, we'd feel it. But I found myself glancing out the small galley window anyway. Both engines glowed steadily against the night sky, the left one catching a faint reflection from the moon. Everything looked fine. Too fine. An hour later, as the passengers dozed and the cabin dimmed, I saw Captain Carter step out briefly from the cockpit. His face was pale. He looked like someone who'd seen a ghost but didn't want anyone to know. "Clara," he said quietly, motioning me aside. We replayed the intercom logs. There's no record of any transmission, nothing. But when we checked the flight recorder, he stopped, lowering his voice even more. It picked up something faint. A voice. Mine. My skin prickled. "Yours?" He nodded once, except it wasn't from me. Before I could respond, another faint hiss filled the cabin speakers, followed by the same chilling line. "Mayday, Mayday, Flight 273. The voice sounded more urgent this time, but quieter, like it was fading in from a distance. Every crew member stopped moving. The passengers stirred. A few looked up nervously. The captain's face turned white. He grabbed the nearest handset and said firmly, "This is the captain speaking. Please remain calm. We're experiencing a minor technical issue with our communication system. There is no emergency." His voice, his real one, was calm, steady, human. But it couldn't undo the echo of what we'd heard. The rest of that hour passed in uneasy silence. I remember checking seatbelts that didn't need checking, pouring coffee for passengers who weren't awake, doing anything to distract myself from the strange feeling that the plane itself was trying to tell us something. When the voice didn't return for a while, I thought maybe it was over. But later, long after the lights dimmed and most passengers slept, I walked past the cockpit again and heard the captain muttering to the co-pilot. The door was slightly open. I caught only one line before it shut completely. She said the same words, "Before the crash." I froze. I didn't know who he meant. Maybe someone from another flight, maybe something in his past. But whatever it was, the calm, confident Captain Carter I knew was gone. His voice carried something I'd never heard before. Fear. That night, the air in the cabin felt heavy, charged, as though something invisible was flying with us. None of us could explain how the captain's voice could speak without him, or why it repeated a message that shouldn't exist. All I knew was that the flight that began as the most ordinary evening of my career was about to become the most unsettling one I'd ever lived through. When the first false distress call faded out, Captain Carter and his co-pilot, Elena Markovich, were left staring at the glowing panels in front of them, both too stunned to speak for a few seconds. The cockpit was quiet, except for the soft hum of the instruments and the distant rush of air outside. For pilots with thousands of hours between them, confusion wasn't something they experienced often. But this, hearing the captain's own voice transmitting a mayday he hadn't spoken, wasn't a malfunction they could explain by procedure or logic. Elena was the first to move. "Could it be a stuck mic?" she asked, already checking the radio switches and intercom channels. Her voice was tight but professional. Carter shook his head. "No. I wasn't keyed in when that happened. Look." He pointed to the indicator light that showed no active transmission. Everything was in perfect order. He toggled through the communication frequencies, calling out to air traffic control. "Vienna Center, this is Flight 273. Confirm if you received any Mayday transmission from our aircraft." There was a long pause, just static and faint chatter from other pilots. Then the controller responded. "Negative. Flight 273. We show no emergency signal from your transponder. Are you declaring one?" Carter exhaled, relieved and uneasy at once. "No, negative. We're operating normally. We'll advise if anything changes." When he ended the call, Elena leaned back in her seat, frowning. "The crew heard it, didn't they?" He nodded. "Clara said it came through the cabin speakers. My voice, word for word." Elena's brow furrowed. Could it have been a relay? Maybe interference from another aircraft? Maybe, he said quietly. But what's the statistical chance of interference creating my voice with my phrasing? She didn't answer. Both of them knew the odds were non-existent. Even radio crossfeed doesn't mimic speech perfectly, let alone reproduce an individual's tone and inflection. Carter ran another diagnostic check. All systems green. No warning lights. No faults. Yet the unease in his chest refused to fade. He reached for the cabin intercom, pressed the switch, and spoke into it. "Cabin, this is the cockpit. We're investigating some comm interference. Please stay alert and report if you hear that message again." Minutes passed. Nothing. The flight returned to its normal rhythm, and for a moment he hoped it had just been a freak glitch. But then, the radio crackled again. Not the cabin intercom this time, but their main VHF frequency. "Mayday, Mayday. Flight 263. Engine failure. Immediate. Descent required." The voice was his, absolutely identical, every syllable precise, every breath perfectly matched. The only difference was a strange distortion behind it, like a faint echo. Both pilots stared at the radio as if it might suddenly reveal who was really speaking. Elena switched frequencies in disbelief. "That came through on the active ATC channel," she said, checking her instruments again. "But you didn't transmit." "No," Carter said firmly. "I didn't." He immediately called back to the Vienna Center. "Confirm you heard that last Mayday." This time, ATC responded right away. "Affirmative, Flight 273. We received a full distress call from your aircraft. Are you declaring an emergency?" Elena's head snapped toward him. "They heard it too?" Carter felt a chill crawl up his spine. "We're not declaring anything. That was not us." The controller hesitated. "Copy that. 273. For clarity, the voice matched the transmission signature from your aircraft. We'll note as possible interference." The captain didn't reply immediately. He was staring at the radio display, his mind racing. The system didn't just pick up external chatter. It had broadcast something from them, something neither of them said. He switched to a backup frequency, checking logs and playback data. Nothing appeared in the memory buffer. No trace of outgoing signal. Elena leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Could someone be spoofing us? Like hijacking the frequency?" Carter shook his head again. "If they were, ATC would pick up a mismatch in our transponder code. They said it came from us." The words hung heavy in the air. Then came the knock at the cockpit door. 3 sharp taps. It was Clara, the lead attendant. Carter unlocked it, and she slipped inside quietly, her face pale. "Captain, we heard it again," she said. "Same message, but the intercom indicator didn't light up. It's not coming from you." Carter nodded slowly. "We heard it too. It went out over the main frequency." Clara's eyes darted to the flight instruments, all of which looked perfectly normal. "So what's causing it?" He hesitated. "We're not sure yet." She stood there a moment longer, unsure whether to stay or go. Elena gave her a reassuring nod. "It's all right. We're handling it." As the door closed again, silence returned. Only the rhythmic hum of the engines filled the space, a reminder that despite the eerie transmissions, the aircraft itself was fine. But Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something unseen, manipulating the systems that had never failed him before. He decided to run a manual test on the intercom circuits. One by one, he disconnected and reconnected each channel, listening for anomalies. Everything functioned perfectly. When he finished, he sat back, exhausted but still alert. Then, out of nowhere, the cabin intercom came alive once more. "Mayday, Mayday. Flight 263. Engine failure. Immediate descent required." Elena's hands froze over the throttle. The intercom switch was off. No light, no transmission input, and yet the voice filled the cockpit again, his own, speaking from nowhere. Only this time, there was something new. After the repeated line, a faint whisper followed, almost blending into the static. Both of them leaned closer to listen. "You should not be here." Elena gasped quietly. Carter's pulse raced. The whisper was distorted, but it was definitely there. He replayed it twice, using the onboard audio log. But on playback, there was only silence. The whisper was gone. For the next few minutes, neither of them spoke. They flew on autopilot, both staring straight ahead, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. It wasn't just a technical fault anymore. It felt deliberate, intelligent. When Carter finally broke the silence, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "If that message really came from us, Elena, then who's talking?" She looked at him, her face pale in the dim cockpit light. "Or what's trying to warn us?" "Oh?" Neither said another word for the rest of that hour. Both sat in silence, surrounded by perfect equipment and a voice that shouldn't exist, one that spoke from their own plane, with a warning neither of them yet understood. The phantom distress call became impossible to ignore. By the time they crossed into French airspace, both pilots were on edge, and the crew in the cabin could feel the tension radiating from behind the cockpit door. The strange voice, the captain's voice, kept repeating the same Mayday at random intervals. Sometimes it would echo faintly through the cabin speakers. Sometimes it would break through their radio frequency, bleeding into communications meant for air traffic control. Each time, it sounded identical. The same tone, the same breathing, the same phrasing, as if a recording of Captain Carter himself was being replayed from nowhere. But it wasn't a recording. Around 10:45 p.m., Air Traffic Control from Geneva contacted them. "Flight 273, confirm your current status. You declared a Mayday 10 minutes ago and transmitted engine failure coordinates. Please verify." Captain Carter and Elena exchanged a look of disbelief. "We didn't declare anything," he replied, his voice steady but tight. "We're operating normally. Engines are stable, all systems green." The controller paused before responding. "Copy that, 273. For reference, the coordinates you transmitted placed you roughly over the Bernese Alps, near the wreck site of Flight 273 over 30 years ago. Are you sure you didn't mean to transmit?" That name, Flight 273, hung in the cockpit like a ghost. Their own flight number. Carter felt his throat go dry. "Repeat that. Did you say Flight 273? "Affirmative," came the reply. "Swiss Air 273, crash of 91. Your transmission matched their final distress call, word for word." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Elena, usually calm under pressure, looked shaken. She opened the onboard log and scrolled through archived data. "Our flight number was recycled 5 years ago when the route was reintroduced," she said quietly. "Same designation, different aircraft." Carter didn't respond. He just stared at the radio, as if willing it to explain itself. A few minutes later, the voice came again. This time, it played through both the cabin and cockpit simultaneously. "Mayday, Mayday. Flight 273. Engine failure. Immediate descent required." But now there was something new. After a short pause, the voice added, "Altitude dropping. God help us, impact." And then it cut off abruptly. Elena's hand flew to her headset. "Where did that come from?" "I don't know," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But those words, they're not mine." She hesitated. "They sound like a continuation." He nodded. "Like a recording of what came after their last transmission." A memory stirred in his mind, one he hadn't thought about in years. He'd read about the original Flight 273 while training in London. A mysterious mid-air breakup, no survivors, no clear cause. The cockpit voice recorder had captured only fragments of a final Mayday before cutting off. The same phrasing, the same sequence. The radio came alive again, but this time with a chilling difference. "Mayday, Mayday, Flight 273, the voice began. Then, in a quieter tone, almost human again, it said, "James, we couldn't save them." Elena's eyes widened. "It said your name." Carter's grip on the yoke tightened. His breath came faster, shallow. "That's impossible." He turned off the primary communication system entirely, switching to emergency power. Even with the circuits disabled, the voice continued. It shouldn't have been possible. The sound now came directly from the overhead speakers, bypassing the radio system altogether. Clara, hearing the commotion, opened the cockpit door slightly. "Captain, the passengers are starting to panic. They've been hearing—" "Stay calm, Clara," he interrupted firmly. "We're handling it." "But sir," she continued, voice shaking, "some passengers in the back said they heard children crying over the speakers. There aren't any children on board." For the first time that night, Captain Carter didn't know what to say. The next call from air traffic control came minutes later. This time it wasn't just Geneva. It was also Lisbon Tower trying to reach them. "Flight 273, we've been receiving fragmented distress calls on multiple channels. Your transponder shows brief signal loss every time the voice transmission occurs. Please confirm your current altitude." Elena checked the readings. "Altitude holding steady at 36,000 feet, she said quickly. "Lisbon Tower copies," the controller replied. "But your secondary radar shows a brief duplicate blip, same ID code, same frequency, appearing just south of your position before disappearing." Carter froze. "A duplicate transponder?" "Yes, sir," the voice confirmed. "As if another Flight 273 exists in proximity." The cockpit went silent. Elena turned to him slowly. "If that's true, then that voice isn't interference. It's coming from something or someone mirroring us." Carter leaned forward, scanning the radar display. It was clear, no nearby traffic, just empty airspace and the black void of night outside. Yet, every few minutes, a faint flicker appeared on the lower left corner of the radar, same transponder code, same heading, same altitude, and then vanished. "Maybe it's a reflection," he murmured, almost convincing himself. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. When the voice returned, it sounded closer, too close. It echoed in the cockpit, as if spoken from just behind them. "James, check your left engine," Elena gasped. Carter whipped his head around, but there was no one there. He switched on the external cameras immediately, zooming in on the left wing. At first, everything looked normal. The engine glowed steadily against the night. But then he noticed something faint, a shimmer, almost like heat distortion, just beside the engine intake. A shape is trying to form in the blur. It lasted only a second before the image reset to normal. Elena's voice broke the silence. "Whatever this is, it knows too much." He nodded slowly. "It knows us." Down in the cabin, passengers were starting to whisper. Some had recorded snippets of the mysterious voice on their phones, and the recordings showed something strange. When played back, the voice was barely audible, but a faint background sound emerged instead. The rhythmic thrum of engines struggling, metal tearing, and a single line buried deep in the static. "This is Flight 273, descending please anyone, copy." That message hadn't come from their flight. Carter knew it. Elena knew it. And by then, everyone on board could feel it. Something from another Flight 273, from another time, was still transmitting. A distress call trapped in the airwaves, caught in a loop across decades, now reaching out to them through the same sky. The only question left was why, and whether their own flight was next to join it. The moment the voice went silent, an unnatural stillness filled the aircraft. It wasn't the kind of quiet that followed a routine announcement. It was the kind that made people stop breathing, as if the air itself had thickened. Every crew member could feel it, even before anyone said a word. The hum of the engines, the faint rattle of the overhead bins, the low vibration of the fuselage, all the usual background sounds seemed muffled, like the world outside had faded away. Captain Carter sat frozen at the controls, eyes fixed on the glowing instruments. Everything read normally, airspeed steady, altitude stable, engines are performing perfectly. But something about the silence after that final transmission felt wrong, like an invisible hand had just lifted away from them. He turned to Elena, who was watching the radar with an expression that bordered on disbelief. "Did you hear that last part?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. It said my name. Elena swallowed hard. And it knew about your daughter. Carter's fingers tightened around the yoke. He didn't respond right away. The voice's last transmission hadn't been the usual Mayday. It had a broken pattern. After repeating the familiar emergency code, it had whispered something low, cracked with static, but still unmistakably clear. Tell Lily I'm sorry. Lily was his daughter. She'd died 6 years earlier in a car accident. No one outside of a few close colleagues even knew her name. Maybe someone hacked the frequency, Elena said, though she didn't sound convinced. He shook his head slowly. No hacker could know that. From the cabin, Clara's voice came through the interphone, quiet but tense. Captain, the passengers are restless. A few said the lights flickered when the last message came through. Carter looked up at the ceiling panel. The interior lights were steady now, but he remembered seeing the faintest blink just before the whisper ended. Keep them calm, he said. We'll make a cabin announcement soon. But Clara hesitated. Sir, I think you should know. A passenger in row 14 recorded the sound. When he played it back, it wasn't your voice anymore. What do you mean? He said it sounded older, like someone else was speaking with you. Elena leaned over, pressing the mute button on the interphone. James, this is getting out of control. We should divert, land early. He nodded slowly, glancing at the flight path display. Lisbon was less than an hour away, but Geneva or Madrid were closer. He was about to change course when the cockpit lights flickered again, only for a split second, but enough to send a shiver through the air. Then came the faintest sound from the overhead speaker, not words this time, but something like shallow breathing, a steady inhale, exhale, just above a whisper. Both pilots froze. The sound was soft but intimate, as if someone was standing right between them. Audio feed's off, Elena said, her voice trembling. How is that still? Before she could finish, the breathing stopped, and the intercom clicked alive again. A new message began, weaker than before, the voice trembling as if it came from somewhere far away. This is Flight 273, descending, fire on the left engine, losing altitude. Carter and Elena exchanged a horrified look. The coordinates embedded in the signal matched the crash report from the 1991 Flight 273 incident, the same one that had gone down over the Alps. Elena whispered. We're hearing the final moments of their flight. Carter could barely respond. His mind raced through training, procedures, and rational explanations, but none fit. He turned to the window, staring into the pitch-black expanse of night outside. The stars looked blurred, the horizon oddly hazy, as though something in the distance was moving with them. Then, without warning, turbulence hit. A hard, jarring drop that sent the coffee cups in the galley flying. The seatbelt signs lit up instantly. Clara's voice came through again, this time shaking. Captain, what's happening? Unexpected pocket, Carter replied quickly, forcing calm into his tone. But his hands gripped the controls tightly. Everyone seated, belts on. The turbulence subsided as fast as it came, leaving behind an even deeper silence. But outside the window, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. James, she said quietly. Look, far below them, cutting through the darkness of the clouds, a faint glimmer of light appeared. 2, then 4, then an entire outline of an aircraft illuminated by moonlight. It was flying parallel to them, slightly lower, but completely silent. Its navigation lights blinked faintly, red and green, just like theirs. Elena's voice broke. Is that a reflection? Carter didn't answer. He was staring too hard, heart pounding in his chest. The silhouette was unmistakable. It was an aircraft identical to theirs. Same model, same size, same position. But the tail marking was what made his breath stop. The faded white letters on the tail read, 270. 3. He blinked, and it was gone. Elena gasped. Did you see it? He nodded slowly. Yeah, I saw it. The radio crackled again, softly. A single fading sentence. We're still here." Elena looked at him, her face pale in the dim cockpit glow. "What if the call wasn't a warning?" she whispered. "What if it was a memory trying to repeat itself?" For the first time in his career, Captain James Carter felt true fear, not of malfunction or weather or mechanical failure, but of the unknown that had somehow found its way into his cockpit. The flight that had begun with calm skies was now haunted by echoes of the past, voices that refused to die, and a reflection of a plane that shouldn't exist. Down in the cabin, passengers clutched their armrests, whispering prayers. Some claimed they could feel a cold draft running through the aisle, though every vent was closed. Others said they heard faint knocking under their seats, like something tapping from below. Clara walked down the aisle, forcing a professional smile, but her hands were trembling. When she reached the back, she glanced out the small window on the rear door and froze. For just a second, through the mist outside, she saw another set of cabin lights beside them. Rows of faint, ghostly lights stretching into the dark. A plane flying close, perfectly aligned. Then it faded, as if swallowed by the clouds. She turned away quickly, heart racing, whispering a single line under her breath. "Please, let us land." But as the plane steadied again, the voice returned one last time, soft, breaking, almost sorrowful. "Mayday, Mayday, Flight 273, impact confirmed." And then there was only silence. The rest of the flight continued in a daze. No more voices, no more flickers, just a heavy, haunted quiet as the aircraft crossed into Portuguese airspace. The crew went through the motions, but no one spoke of what they'd seen. No one dared to. And in that long stretch of night sky, with stars glinting like cold eyes above the clouds, it felt as though two flights, one living, one lost, had crossed paths for just a moment, bound together by a call for help that refused to fade away. When Flight 273 finally touched down in Lisbon, the landing was so smooth it almost felt unreal, like the entire aircraft had exhaled at once. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The passengers sat quietly, waiting for the familiar sense of relief that usually followed a safe arrival, but it didn't come. The air in the cabin was heavy, as if some part of that strange night had followed them down. Captain Carter guided the aircraft to the gate with practiced calm, but his hands were still trembling on the controls. When they came to a stop, he cut the engines and sat there for a moment, staring out into the dark runway lights. The silence inside the cockpit was almost unbearable. Elena finally reached out and touched his arm. "We're on the ground," she said softly, as if reminding him it was real. He nodded once. "Yeah, we made it." Outside, the ground crew approached as usual, waving their orange batons. Everything looked normal, routine. But as Carter glanced at the reflection in the cockpit window, he thought, just for a moment, that he saw another plane parked beside theirs. The same model, the same tail number. Then he blinked, and it was gone. The passengers disembarked quickly, their faces pale and tired. Some looked spooked, others confused. A few clutched their phones, showing recordings of the eerie voice they'd captured midair. None of the recordings was clear. The words were scrambled, half buried in static. On one clip, all you could make out was the faint sound of breathing and a single whisper that no one could quite identify. When the cabin was empty, Clara stood near the exit door, watching the last passenger step onto the jet bridge. She turned to Carter. "Captain, I've been flying for almost 8 years. I've heard strange things before, static, feedback, echoes, but never something that spoke to us." He didn't respond right away. His face was pale, his eyes distant. "It wasn't interference," he said finally. "It was intentional. Whatever that was, it knew us." Elena stayed behind as maintenance crews came aboard. They checked every inch of the communication system, the intercom, the radio, the circuit boards, even the backup electrical units. Everything tested perfectly. No faults. No evidence of transmission errors. The flight recorders were pulled for analysis, But the cockpit voice recorder showed nothing except the normal flight communications and silence where the phantom distress call should have been. That silence was the most unsettling part. Later that night, while the crew waited for debriefing, Carter sat alone in the operations lounge, his flight cap resting beside him. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly. His phone buzzed with a message, an internal notification from the airline's technical department. No anomalies detected. Aircraft cleared for service. He stared at the screen for a long time before switching it off. Clara joined him a few minutes later, a cup of black coffee in her hand. "They're saying it was interference from an old military frequency," she said. "That's their official explanation." Carter let out a tired laugh, short and humorless. "Convenient." She sat across from him. "You don't believe it, do you?" He looked up slowly. "That voice said my daughter's name. That's not static." She hesitated. "Do you think it was something else?" He didn't answer, but his silence said more than words could. By morning, the story had already started to spread through the airline's internal channels. The flight logs showed no incident report, but the crew couldn't hide the truth. Pilots from other routes whispered about the Echo flight, a plane that carried voices from another time. Some said they'd experienced similar brief transmissions, snippets of call signs, words out of place, fragments of distress codes from flights long gone. None of them lasted as long or spoke as clearly as what Flight 273 heard that night. The airline quietly grounded the aircraft for 6 days. Engineers stripped it down to its framework, checking the wiring, replacing components, and testing every signal pathway. When they finished, they found nothing unusual. Not one faulty wire. Not one corrupted data log. The plane went back into service the following week. But Captain James Carter never flew it again. He filed for medical leave a few days later, citing stress-related fatigue. The truth, however, was more personal. On his last visit to the cockpit before signing off, he sat alone in the left seat, running his hand along the worn leather armrest. The air inside felt colder than usual. He closed his eyes, trying to convince himself it was just exhaustion, that the voice, the lights, the ghostly reflection beside them had all been tricks of the mind after too many long-haul flights. Then, faintly, through the silence, the intercom clicked once, just once. He froze, his heart hammering. No voice followed, no whisper. Just the click, a soft reminder that something, somewhere, was still listening. He stood up quickly, gathered his things, and walked out of the cockpit without looking back. A few months later, the flight number was officially retired. Flight 273 no longer appeared on any route map. The aircraft itself was reassigned under a new registration and continued service across Europe. Most passengers who flew it never knew anything strange had ever happened. But for those who had been there that night, especially the crew, the memory never faded. Sometimes, when a storm rolled in or the air was thick with static, Clara swore she could still hear faint interference over the PA during her flights, like someone trying to speak from far away. She'd pause for a moment, hand hovering over the switch, listening to the static crackle, waiting for the familiar voice that once haunted them. It never came again. Still, whenever she walked through the terminal at night and saw a plane taxiing out for departure under the number 273, she'd stop and watch the taillights disappear into the dark, wondering if somewhere out there, high above the clouds, the sky still carried the echoes of a distress call that refused to die. And every time she did, she'd hear the words in her head, calm, urgent, and impossibly familiar. "Mayday, Mayday."